Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Freedom House. Good to see friends and colleagues of many years here. This is the Mark Palmer Forum. It is part of a speaker series in memory of Mark Palmer, who was vice chair of the board of Freedom House. As pictured in the rear of the room, when Mark Palmer was ambassador to Hungary, he went into the streets with those who were calling for freedom before the Berlin Wall had gone down, and he stood in his post-foreign service life for the idea of diplomats standing up for civil society, very pertinent to our subject of today. In fact, our conference room here is named after Mark as well. I really want to thank Sushma Palmer, who has generously supported Freedom House's work, and in particular this ongoing forum, the key event of which is this annual conference. Our goals today, and they are in fact the ones of the Mark Palmer Forum, are best captured by the word solidarity. Solidarity with those in civil society around the world who are under pressure in a backlash against civil society by colluding autocrats. Solidarity between the democracies, not just Western democracies, but democracies of the global South as well, to stand with those civil society efforts and in fact, in multilateral fora and diplomacy, the democracies working together. And then a final form of solidarity, which is part of Freedom House's DNA, an organization formed in 1941 with its original co-chairs being Eleanor Roosevelt and the man who lost the election to her husband a year earlier, Wendell Willkie. Solidarity between Republicans and Democrats on placing democratic governance centrally in our foreign policy. So our program will begin with a keynote address, a real treat, with the Deputy Secretary of State, a panel of frontline specialists in human rights defenders from multiple regions of the world, and then a pretty august panel of two very serious Democrats and two very serious Republicans to talk, as we're entering the silly season of presidential politics, how democracy and human rights can be placed centrally in U.S. foreign policy. So it's a special pleasure in terms of that last form of Republicans and Democrats being on the same page to introduce our keynote speaker. Deputy Secretary Anthony Blinken served in the past as the Democratic Staff Director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2002 to 2008. In fact, we overlapped there. I was on the opposite side on the Republican staff. There were some famous collaborations between Senator Helms and Senator Biden at the time. Things were different then. We should make them that way again. Tony Blinken was sworn in as Deputy Secretary of State in January. He had previously served as Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, where he chaired the very important Interagency Deputies Committee. Earlier in the Obama administration, he served as a Deputy Assistant to the President and National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. Earlier in his career, he had been at CSIS, and he had served at length at the NSC in the Clinton administration as Senior Director for European Affairs, Senior Director for Speechwriting, and Senior Director for Strategic Planning. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Law School. Without further ado, the Deputy Secretary of State.
First, make sure my microphone is on. Is that working? Yes. Great. Well, thank you very, very much, and good afternoon to all of you. And Mark, especially good afternoon to you, and thank you for a very warm introduction, and much more important than that, for the extraordinary work that you're doing and that Freedom House is doing every day. I think that we know all too well that the ideals of democracy do not realize themselves. They're realized in the determination and the passion that everyone in this community, so many of you in this room, bring to the defense of liberty, justice, and dignity around the world. Freedom House's analysis and its advocacy set the yardstick by which we assess our efforts and hold ourselves to a higher standard. And I have to say, it's also great to be here with Sushma Palmer. Mark Palmer was a long-standing friend of my family's and a tireless and effective advocate for democracy and human rights. But I also have to tell you, I very much appreciate your highly strategic approach to today's event. I can tell you there's no better source of motivation than speaking ahead of a panel that I'm told is entitled Priorities for the Next Administration. So challenge accepted. I'll do my best. Just 2 weeks ago, Mark and I sat down together in New York with two individuals of tremendous courage from Burundi and Azerbaijan who risked their lives to fight for human rights. Both had faced threats so great that they had to call for help. And that call was answered by something called Lifeline, a fund for embattled civil society organizations that Freedom House manages, with support from a cross-section, quite literally, of the world, including the United States, Norway, Mongolia, Chile. It provides aid in times of greatest need, literally paying for locks on doors, guards at the gate, cameras on roofs, and if need be, relocation to safe harbor when human rights advocates and defenders are under threat. And as we know, they are under threat more than ever before. The space for civil society is shrinking in many parts of the world. It's under attack through restrictive laws, arbitrary arrests, and sanctioned brutality. It's under siege, where power has become concentrated in the hands of a few and corruption a way of life. It's under threat by those who see independent media, free assembly, and open society as a source of insecurity instead of a great reservoir of strength and stability. And over the last 3 years, more than 50 countries have introduced or enacted measures to restrict civil society. China and Russia are in the front of this campaign, but they found company around the world, from Cambodia to Venezuela to Kazakhstan. Some see in this tide of repression proof that societies have begun to reject democracy, when in fact it is very much the opposite. The crackdown on civil society is not a reaction to the disappointment of democracy. It is a response to its enduring and powerful appeal, and indeed the recent success of democratic movements in many regions to raise the expectations of citizens and empower them to demand their basic rights. And even as it has come under siege and increasing threat, civil society has also drawn strength from powerful new tools that are making governments more open, data more accessible, and citizens more informed and connected. Just as repressive regimes copy and paste laws from one another, the democratization of technology has given citizens a platform to learn, to create, to engage their governments, to raise their voices together. Now, many who repress rights do so in the name of stability, their code word for keeping entrenched interests in power. But I think we all know and believe that the best guarantor of stability is not control, it's freedom. Nearly every major national security issue we face is at its core a failure of governance. The inability of governments to live up to the most fundamental of responsibilities to protect the lives and the rights of their citizens can devastate nations, destabilize regions, and ultimately pose a threat to the United States. So democracy is not only hardwired into our values, it's also at the front line of our defense. It serves as a bulwark against extremism and radicalization precisely because it gives all people the opportunity to express their rights, pursue their ambitions, and redress their grievances peacefully. By unleashing human talent and advancing human dignity, democracy also strengthens peace, security, and prosperity throughout the world in the long run. But over the short term, the picture is cloudy and in many places quite bleak. The march of human progress never travels in a straight line, President Obama said to the nations gathered at the United Nations General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago in New York. We know, you know, so well that the work of democracy is painstakingly hard. It's marked by times of struggle and setback when the results of our efforts do not meet our expectations and our actions fall short of our ideals. Today, we face one of those times when our fervent wishes for the world seem to outpace our ability to realize them. At moments like these, the disappointment and frustrations are very, very real. And that's true for advocates, it's true for policymakers, and it's mostly true for the people who are on the front lines and living these challenges every day. But it is in the face of exactly these challenges that we must remain clear-eyed about our role and our responsibility. The United States cannot dictate outcomes, much as we'd like to. We cannot solve all the world's problems. We cannot fully solve any of them alone. But we also can't retreat or abdicate our unique capabilities to influence and to shape change. And it's precisely in these kinds of moments, when more is actually demanded of us, that we have an obligation to try to come together as a global community to act in defense of our values and all of those who share them. That's why we're helping develop regional innovation hubs through the Stand with Civil Society initiative, training journalists to keep themselves and their information safe, deepening our diplomatic engagement through our presidency of the Community of Democracies, easing the path for reformers through the Open Government Partnership, and promoting the new Sustainable Development Goal 16, which, for the first time, places fundamental freedoms, the rule of law, and accountable institutions on the global development agenda. Sometimes, even simply shining a light in the dark places can make a difference. For example, just this past September, led by our Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, we featured 20 cases of women being unjustly detained for their beliefs or for their defense of the rights of others. And for 20 days, we told their stories and showcased their courage. And recently, we were able to celebrate the release of two of these women, Ta Phong Thun from Vietnam and Sana Sif of Egypt. But of course, we know that many, many more remain detained, and the fight continues. Across the world, against all headwinds, people are affirming their rights. They're bringing a commitment to democratic reform that is proving stronger than the entrenchment of corruption, indignity, or oppression. Tunisia, Burma, Ukraine, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. While each of these journeys is far, far from complete, we've worked to give the champions of democracy the consistent support they need to translate their aspirations into lasting results. Just last week, these voices were given a tremendous boost when a coalition of human rights defenders, lawyers, business owners, and labor union leaders in Tunisia were awarded the highest prize for peace. By preserving national unity and creating a peaceful political process from scratch, the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet has chiseled the fragile foundations of democratic governance out of the rubble of dictatorship and revolution. 4 years ago, when Mohamed Bouazizi inspired the Arab Spring, Tunisian people rose up in an act of defiance that reminded us that no one, no single country, no single culture, no single faith has a monopoly on democratic ideals. In the short years since, the Tunisian model of governance has shown how citizens across the political spectrum can come together to solve public challenges despite their profound differences. Secular and Islamist parties have united to undertake their own democratic experiment. It's a powerful model in a region very much in need of one. We've tried to match Tunisia's commitment with our own, deepening the economic, security, and political support that it needs to make the most of this moment. We brought 60 organizations from marginalized regions together to form a civil society network, the first of its kind in Tunisia. We extended almost $1 billion in loan guarantees to help the government gain affordable financing from international capital. We've invested in Tunisia's efforts to reform their police and justice system, and we're helping their parliament and parties institutionalize the democratic practices that the nation's leaders have started. And of course, remarkably, this progress has occurred despite the savagery of those who seek to undermine it. The evil at the heart of the attack on the Bardo Museum in March or in Susa in June have raised the specter of violence that has torn apart other countries in the region. Tunisians know that the reflex to meet extremism with extremism threatens to provoke a dangerous spiral of grievance and repression. That's why we're working together to bolster their ability to counter threats without trampling rights. By fostering an open society, Tunisia is proving that the best answer to an ideology of terror is a commitment to the ideals of democracy. Now, you all know this very well. Experts say that on average, successful transitions from dictatorship to full democracy with rule of law take somewhere between 15 and 20 years in the best of circumstances. For Tunisia and the rest of the region, it's been 4.5 years since the Arab Spring began. Indeed, most places where we're now beginning to see progress, it took far longer and required great patience, perseverance, and engagement. When President Obama took office, he sent this message out to those who ruled their nations by fear. He said, and I quote, "We will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist." Over the last few years, we've seen America's commitment to engagement begin to coax results, from Cuba to Iran to Burma. And in the 2 decades since we established relations with Vietnam, it has integrated itself into the international community, and its citizens are beginning to benefit from greater freedoms. We're redoubling our efforts to encourage them to be a more positive and constructive global player. The prospect of the recently completed Trans-Pacific Partnership has encouraged Vietnam to foster a more free and open society. As part of TPP, for instance, Vietnam will allow, for the first time, the creation of independent grassroots trade unions that can bargain collectively, organize, and lead strikes. We've been very clear with our Vietnamese partners that our relationship will grow only as Vietnam's commitment to human rights does the same. Through genuine reform, Vietnam has become more connected to the United States, as we saw just this past summer when President Obama received in the Oval Office the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Over the last several years, the people of Burma have also undertaken their own journey, as targeted sanctions and consistent diplomatic engagement empowered those on the inside pushing for change. Our top officials, including the president, have engaged extensively with all parts of the government and civil society to support this transformation through constitutional reform, through helping to resolve ethnic and civil conflict, and through pressing for the release of political prisoners and an end to human rights abuses, and engaging more than 3,000 young people in President Obama's Young Southeast Asia Leaders Initiative. We all know that significant challenges remain in front of Burma. The military continues to retain 25% of all seats in parliaments. There are restrictions on free speech and association that continue, and of course, we've seen the pervasive discrimination against the Rohingya and some of the results, including just this spring, the horrific images and reality of people fleeing that persecution, taking to boats, putting themselves in the hands of human traffickers. True democratic change is a long-term process, and Burma still has a long way to go in building new political practices, cultures, and institutions that protect the rights and dignities of all people, regardless of race or religion. And of course, it is coming on very important elections in November, and will continue to press for the rights of its people to participate and set a positive course for the future. There's no guarantee of success in this effort. But I think what is taking hold in Burma is the notion that very few people, if anyone, wants to go back to the old Burma when they are starting to see the potential of the new Burma. So I think we have some reasons to be hopeful. And again, in the last year alone, besides the examples I've cited, we've also seen people, countries affirm their commitment to democracy through historic elections in Sri Lanka and Nigeria. Twice now, Sri Lankans have voted as one nation for a new path of hope and renewal and a return to good governance. For years, the United States has supported the democratic aspirations of the Sri Lankan people. This year, the new Sri Lankan government joined the United States and 25 other countries to co-sponsor a consensus resolution that represented a shared recognition of the importance of truth and justice in Sri Lanka. By sponsoring a resolution that they used to impose, the Sri Lankan government has committed itself to the challenging process of actually accounting for the past, and we're proud to stand with them as they work down this path. In Nigeria, despite election delays, despite fears of fraud, almost 28 million people stood in long lines for hours on end on election day with extraordinary resolve and commitment to the democratic electoral process. Thanks to the incredibly impressive work of the Independent National Electoral Commission, but also critically civil society organizations, which ran parallel vote tabulations, Nigeria ushered in the first peaceful democratic transition of power between two parties. It was a result that many of us, and I think many of you in this room, worked to help make possible, from supporting that parallel vote tabulation to funding civic education drives to helping internally displaced people actually cast ballots. Together, Nigerians sent a very powerful message to the region, to the continent, and indeed to the world, that leaders are actually accountable to their people. We have a number of elections that are now very close on the horizon, especially in Africa, and the world will be watching to see if leaders meet their nation's demand for democracy and live up to the standards their fellow citizens expect and deserve. No two nations are going to follow the same path to self-government, But we know there are no shortcuts or half measures. We also know that democracy is about a lot more than campaigns or votes. It is about preserving the rights of citizens who take to the streets and protest, or journalists who pick up their pens to report, or activists who speak their mind in dissent. It's about delivering on promises and providing services. It's about building institutions that are transparent in their decisions and accountable for their actions. And it's about respecting the limits of democratic power. When leaders try to stay in office or challenge the consent of the governed, they risk instability and strife. We've been very clear on this point. Term limits are not trivial footnotes in a democratic system. They're fundamental. They enable peaceful transfers of power. They give new generations the opportunity to compete for political office and elect new leaders. And we're not alone in this insistence. The African Union agrees, and so do African publics. Afrobarometer recently reported that 75% of citizens that they surveyed consistently favored term limits, a fact that those seeking re-election in 2016 would be wise to consider. Across the globe, we can see both the bright lights of progress and the dark shadows of struggle. All of us in this room who witnessed the surge of democratic experiments in the 1990s are anxiously watching places where progress is backsliding. There are days, too many days, when we have no good choices, when our short-term interests collide with our long-term goals and indeed our ideals. Our job is to figure out how to use the influence we have to navigate this complexity. And it's our responsibility to strive to the best of our ability to align our actions with our interests and principles and mobilize others to do the same. So this means we must continually question our assumptions and premises. It means we have to recalibrate our engagement when the situation on the ground changes. And it means doing our part to see that our resources match our commitment. Both Congress and this administration recognize that American security is strengthened by political freedom and pluralism around the world. And in recent years, our financial support to this vital component of our foreign policy has been far outstripped by the needs. So we're working to increase the funding for democracy, human rights, and governance programs in fiscal year 2016. And that's what we proposed in our budget request. And we need congressional support to achieve that. Let me conclude with a couple of final thoughts. This is, I think, also an important moment because what we're seeing is an old alternative ideology reemerging. An ideology that targets not only the tools of democracy, but also its very norms. It suggests that democratic values lead to violence and disorder, and that people are better off and societies are more stable with the strong arm of centralized power and the safety blanket of control. The people who profess this idea would have us believe that encouraging political competition, supporting changes in leadership, allowing people to write and say anything they want, destabilizes fragile societies. They would have us believe that the democratic movements of the Arab Spring were responsible for disorder in the Middle East, rather than the dictators who spent decades hollowing out their country's institutions, priming sectarian divisions, and meeting peaceful calls for change with barrel bombs. They would have us believe that the separatism in eastern Ukraine was a real phenomenon, rather than an invention, a reverse Maidan engineered by President Putin to justify the brazen occupation and violent rule of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine and undermine the rights of Ukraine's citizens and no one else to determine their country's future. We don't hear these arguments just from bullies standing on the dais of the UN General Assembly, but from proxy regimes and local leaders across the world who sow distrust, fear, and hate, masked as legitimate skepticism and debate. And this is not just an academic dispute. Those who are acting on these ideas are actually upending the international order. When tens of thousands of Russian citizens took to the streets chanting, "We exist, we exist," President Putin blamed it on the international community, giving the US Department of State credit that we don't deserve. When students, business owners, veterans, and grandmothers endured the freezing cold on the Maidan to demand an end to corruption and insist that their leaders make good on promises, President Putin invaded their country to make their democratic experiment fail, because it was a threat to his own experiment. And now in Syria, we see that Russia has gone to war to bolster an authoritarian regime that's brutalizing its own citizens and attracting the world's worst terrorists, ensuring more suffering, more refugee flight, and more space for Daesh. In the face of such acts, it's tempting to want a grand American solution that imposes freedom and order overnight. We should and we must debate our strategies and consider all of our options. But we cannot deny the lessons we've learned over a decade of sacrifice about the effectiveness and sustainability of large-scale, open-ended military interventions. We also know this: dictators can start wars, they can marshal support by muddying the truth, they can provide short-lived order by imprisoning their own people, they can compel some growth through centralized planning. But what they cannot do is maximize the true wealth of their nations. If you asked an academic or a historian 50 or 100 years ago what defines the wealth of a nation, they would say, well, it's the size of its population, the expanse of its landmass, its abundance of natural resources, the power of its military. And of course, all of those factors are still important. And here in America, we're blessed to have an abundance of them. But I think all of you know better than anyone that what really matters in the 21st century, what really constitutes the wealth of a nation, is its human resource and the ability of that resource to create, to innovate, to think, to argue, and even if necessary, to fail. That is the strength of nations. That is the wealth of nations. And systems that do not cultivate this potential, and indeed that work to destroy it, will not flourish in the 21st century. They do not protect minorities from oppression by the majority. They do not foster broad-based growth, value truth, or respect the dignity of their own citizens. They steal trade secrets because they must. They invade other countries to distract from problems at home. They repress civil society because civil society is stronger than they are. And they won't succeed in this century any more than they ultimately did in the last one. But that doesn't mean that we can sit back and wait for them to confront their fatal flaws. We can take action in defense of our values and those who share them. We can build the capacity of our partners, civil society leaders, foremost among them, to tackle the challenges they face with our strong, but also smart support. As we do, authoritarians and extremists will find that their politics of division and ideologies of hate will have precipitated exactly what they hope to destroy: a world of greater unity, repaired peace, and a resurgence of faith in our shared democratic ideals. But only if we keep working to make it so. Thank you very much.
Well, superb food for thought. I'm going to ask a couple of initial questions. If some of you in the audience would like to get index cards from our staff and would like to pass up some questions, there should be an opportunity for a couple of your questions to be directed to the Deputy Secretary as well. Well, in the end of your remarks, you pointed to some striking cases where ideals of freedom and geopolitics align, Ukraine and Syria. But there are those short-term situations where they're balancing acts and interests and ideals appear to collide. I wanted to ask you about one. Our own board member at Freedom House, Dennis Blair, familiar with him from government, he made the case in an op-ed a while ago that the United States sort of gave a light touch to Bahrain when it received Saudi Arabia's assistance to squash civil society dissent. One might assume, as you're trying to collect up those in a coalition to fight ISIS, that there might be even less appetite to scold Bahrain's leaders or tell them in a form of tough love, don't keep a lid on civil society because it's only going to be a pressure cooker. How would you take that example about the balancing act that you alluded to in your remarks?
I think it's a constant struggle, and it is one that, depending on where you are, you may balance one way or another. And having served, as you said before, Mark, in Congress, having worked closely with members of the advocacy community, being in the executive branch, there are certainly differences in the emphasis that you give in this balancing act. And I think for those of us in the executive branch, the struggle is constantly one of this debate between whether it is more important ultimately to try and have the camel's nose under the tent and try to use that to influence the direction that countries take, or whether we need at certain moments to stand absolutely on principle and thus outside and use the weight that we have and whatever tools we have to influence change. And there's an almost constant back and forth between those two poles. I think in the case of Bahrain, what we've seen is that some progress was made that we wanted to recognize. And while we continue to place restrictions on the provision of material to the Ministry of Interior, which was largely responsible for some of the acts that took place that repressed those who were trying to express their opinions, we've seen an internal inquiry result in progress, including the establishment of an ombudsman, including the establishment of a special investigative unit, including training for police and security services in human rights. And those are positives. And we sought to recognize those. We've also sought to strengthen those within Bahrain who are trying to advance in that direction. At the same time, we've seen, whenever there's been one step forward, another step arguably moving backward, including, for example, the release of prominent political dissidents who were then rearrested, and the ongoing detention of the leader of Wifaq, a peaceful group that would be a vehicle for advancing peaceful change, but it is being pushed into jail and into the shadows. I think the dilemma for governments is to recognize that if you won't engage with moderates, and if to the contrary you marginalize them, then you're going to actually simply give power and momentum and energy to the extremes. And my concern in the case of Bahrain is that these are difficult issues, these are challenging issues. Bahrain is a close partner of the United States and critical in dealing with security challenges in that part of the world. But if the moderates get marginalized, the extremes will come to the fore, and that's not going to be good for Bahrain. It's also not going to be good for the United States.
We have an easy one from the audience. How should the U.S. promote democracy in China? What are the biggest obstacles?
So I just returned from China a few days ago, and we arguably have no more important relationship going forward over the coming decades. And what we've been trying to do with China is to deepen our areas of cooperation while dealing very forthrightly with our differences, not ignoring them, but engaging them. And if not resolve them, at least trying to make progress. And I'd argue that in many areas we've been able to achieve just that. Most recently, as you all know, President Xi was here, and we dealt with a number of issues that were front and center on the agenda. Besides deepening cooperation, we've had cybersecurity on the front burner, China's activities in the South China Sea and the maritime domain, and human rights writ large. And when I was there just last week, I raised the cases of individual dissidents or human rights defenders who've been imprisoned only because they were seeking to defend rights or defend those who were trying to assert their rights. Lawyers, journalists, religious leaders. I raised with the Chinese our deep concerns about what they're doing to those who seek to practice their religions in peace, including the demolition of churches and the removal of crosses from the public sphere. And so what we do is we raise these issues on a regular basis. We raise the cases of individuals, and we constantly push on this. But ultimately, it comes back to what I was talking about a little bit a few minutes ago. And that is a question of whether China recognizes that it can't possibly achieve its own aspirations if it continues down the path of actually holding back and repressing its own people. China wants to move from the tremendous achievements it's already had in terms of lifting so many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty to the next stage of development, which is to become a truly innovative society. But if your people are not allowed to think freely, to create, to argue, to disagree, to dissent, you will not become an innovative society. That, to me at least, is one of the profound lessons of recent history. And I think, and I hope, that there will be a growing recognition of that in China over time. China places a premium on stability. We understand that. A country that big, that complicated, you can understand why stability is so important. But of course, our view is, as we discussed, profoundly that freedom is actually the best guarantor of stability. And that's an argument, an ongoing argument that we're having with China. I don't have a magic solution. I believe that the more China is engaged in the world, the more we're engaged with China, over time, the greater ability we will have to help it move in a direction that actually is profoundly in its self-interest. And the irony is this: the Chinese often accuse us, or the people believe that somehow we're trying to contain China or hold it back, prevent its emergence. If we were actually trying to do that, we wouldn't raise any of these issues. The single best way to hold China back and to prevent it from emerging would be for it to continue policies that actually prevent its own people from fulfilling their potential. That is the greatest strength that China brings to this. And if it continues to repress that strength, at the end of the day, it will recognize that it, in fact, has contained itself. But again, this requires a certain amount of self-recognition that is not yet evident.
Just a quick comment. You referred in your remarks to Vietnam and Burma and efforts by the United States to press them forward. There's a balancing act there, as one is concerned about China as a power, as you use the TPP to try and urge China in the direction of the rules and norms-based area. There must be moments at which you decide whether to press more or press less a nation like a government like Vietnam or Burma, because you're trying to counterbalance or encourage a change in governance in the bigger player in the region. I would actually like to ask questions on other countries from the audience. You mentioned the administration's engagement policies, including with Iran, says one of our audience members, but the administration did not focus on human rights in the negotiations, but rather the nuclear capacity. Why not? What are the next steps to address the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran?
So the effort that we made with Iran to reach a comprehensive agreement on its nuclear program was, of course, not just the United States. It involved leading powers in the world, the P5 countries, and Germany, and the European Union. And the only issue on the agenda by common agreement and understanding was the nuclear issue. That was the basis for the sanctions that were imposed on Iran. That was the basis for the group of countries that came together, indeed the international community coming together. And that was the problem that we were trying to resolve. If we had sought to insert other issues into the negotiation, whether it was human rights, whether it was the fate of Americans who are unjustly imprisoned in Iran, whether it was Iran's destabilizing activities in the area, one, I doubt we ever would have reached an agreement on the nuclear issue, and two, we simply would not have had the agreement of our partners in this effort to put those issues on the agenda. They might have sought to put their own issues on the agenda. We never would have gotten anywhere. We also believe that in terms of our own security and the security of other countries around the world, the single most pressing issue was to try and deal with Iran's nuclear program and the possibility it would require a weapon. That would prove to be, had we allowed it to go forward, the most destabilizing thing that could happen. So having dealt with that, the question now is, what next? And there are different possibilities, and I don't think we'll know the answer for some period of time. It's possible that the success of this effort, not only from our perspective, but also from Iran's perspective, will further empower those who are more pragmatic in their approach to Iran's policies, both at home and abroad. And if that's the case, there may be a prospect over time for Iran to take a more moderate approach, including in the way that it deals with its own people. It's also possible that others who have a very different view feel that they need to reassert themselves and that things move in a negative direction, even more negative direction on those other fronts. But what we've said very clearly and explicitly and repeatedly, both directly to the Iranians with whom we were negotiating and to our partners and to the international community, is that just because we've reached agreement on this nuclear issue doesn't mean we will let up one iota on our efforts to push back and to prevent Iran's activities in other areas that we and most of the international community profoundly object to, starting with human rights and its destabilizing activities in the region and the support for terrorism. So we'll continue to do that in all the ways, using all the tools that we have, whether it is rhetorical, whether it's shining a spotlight on these abuses, whether it's taking various actions, including sanctions and international approbation, to continue to press and to push. And there, too, I think a question for Iran is whether it comes to its own realization that its own success in the 21st century does not go through the path of repressing its own people. And we'll continue to make that case to the Iranians.
One last question, which probably makes Bahrain look easy by comparison. Important ally of the United States is Saudi Arabia. Sometimes a particular case focuses the mind. A young protester, Ali al-Nimr, as raised by one of our audience members, response to being a protester was literally crucifixion.
Yeah.
So what does the United States do with its ostensible ally when something like this arises, which, by the way, is emblematic of a pattern, not an outlier?
This has been, I think, a common denominator in the relationship with Saudi Arabia from administration to administration, from year to year, from decade to decade. And this is probably a very good example of, on the one hand, a country that is, in many ways, a critical partner in advancing and protecting our own security interests, particularly in working together to combat various forms of terrorism, but at the same time is engaged in actions and policies at home that we profoundly differ with. And if you talk to Saudis, go to Saudi Arabia, I think one of the things you'll hear is that it's important that we look at Saudi Arabia or other similarly situated countries, not just as a still frame in time, but as a moving picture. And they will make the case that there's been progress and an evolution, including slowly the greater integration of women into society and into the workplace, to cite one example. But when we see cases like the one you cited, in which this young man whose alleged offenses were committed when he was a minor, it is abhorrent. And it's something that we have spoken out strongly against, publicly and privately.
Well, thank you for subtle initial remarks and candor in this discussion. It is a long road. You said that we keep our eyes on those places that were undergoing transition since the 1990s. Mark Palmer was ambassador to Hungary. Your father was ambassador to Hungary. Things seem to be going backwards in Hungary. It is a long road, but it is important for the United States to always be on the side of civil society, and actively so. And we here at Freedom House are very happy to be an implementing partner along with the State Department, as well as occasional scold. And we really thank you for kicking off this thought-provoking conference with your initial remarks.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thank you all. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great.